Good evening, everyone. I'm Marie Beam, CEO of Discovery Museum. I'm so glad you're with us tonight. Thank you. Welcome to the fourth event in the 2024 Discovery Museum Speaker Series, The Science of Good Enough Relationships, Trusting and Developing Our Capacity for Simple and Authentic Human Interactions, with Dr. Junlei Lee of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation. Little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As always, the Q&A will be open throughout the event. Please submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button, and we'll address as many as possible after the presentation. The chat will be open tonight, so please share your thoughts. Closed captioning can be turned on and off at the bottom of your screen. Pardon me. And finally, thanks to Junlei for inviting us to record tonight's presentation. We will send a link to the recording to all of you, all of our registrants, once it's available. And we'll also send a resource list with any follow-up information that was referenced during the talk. Let me acknowledge our wonderful speaker series sponsors. Tonight's event is free of charge and open to all, thanks to the loyal support of Enterprise Bank and Sutherland Realty Group, along with all the other generous sponsors shown here. Their support has made this 12th year of the Discovery Museum Speaker Series possible, and we are so proud to have been able to present this to our community for such a long time. Thank you, too, to those of you who generously made a donation when you registered for tonight's event. That helps a lot. It gives us the encouragement and the support to know that this is valuable to you and that you want us to keep this coming. This year's speaker series theme is Conversation, Understanding, Hope. We've chosen to host conversations on topics that can be challenging for families or anyone really to navigate. Our goal is that with the guidance of informed and insightful speakers like Dr. Lee, we can all gain a better understanding of these issues, and through that, a more hopeful perspective on the future and our ability to navigate it. We've hosted some really valuable and very timely conversations this year, and they and many of the last 5 years of Discovery Museum Speaker Series talks are available on our Speaker Series YouTube channel. Please check them out and share them. We want as many people as possible to have access to this content. We have so many loyal friends who join us for the Speaker Series, so you know that Discovery Museum invites kids and their families and caregivers into playful, STEM-rich learning experiences and welcomes them outside to explore and play in nature. Everything we do capitalizes on the natural creativity and curiosity that are in such great abundance in early childhood. We are committed to sustainable operations and working toward carbon neutrality thanks to our on-site 326 kilowatt solar array, and to being an organization that advances equity in and through our own work. Finally, I am really excited and very proud to share one more thing. Yesterday, it was announced that Discovery Museum has been selected for a 2024 National Medal for Museum Service. This annual award from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, is the nation's highest honor for museums, awarded to institutions that make significant and exceptional contributions to their communities. We are beyond grateful for this recognition of our work and impact, and for the support of our community that makes it possible. I'd like to just take a moment to send my personal thanks to our entire wonderful, talented, dedicated staff, to our recently retired leader, Neil Gordon, our board of directors, past and present, and our extraordinary and far-reaching community of friends who all deserve credit for this tremendous accomplishment. Thank you all. We celebrate with you. So we are honored to host Junlei Lee for tonight's conversation. Hi, Junlei. Let me introduce you for a moment. Dr. Junlei Lee is the faculty co-chair of the Human Development and Education Program and Saul Zentz Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research and practice focuses on understanding and supporting the work of helpers, those who serve children and families on the front lines of education and social services. He developed the simple interactions approach to help identify what ordinary people do extraordinarily well with children in everyday moments, and made that the basis for promoting positive system change. Junlei, I'm so happy that you could be with us tonight. This is your second time joining the Discovery Museum Speaker Series. And what better topic could there be now in 2024 as we collectively try to figure out how to be with each other and be there for each other in today's world? We're talking about this at our museum. I'm just back from the National Association of Children's Museums conference, and it was being discussed there across the country and beyond. And I know it's on the mind of caregivers and educators who are here with us tonight. Thank you so much, Junlei, for sharing your wisdom with us this evening.
Marie, thank you so much for inviting me. And first of all, congratulations on the award. But I'm so glad to join you again. I was in preparation for this one. I was looking up the 2019 talk. I panicked for a second. I was like, wait a minute, what if I didn't have anything more to say about what it is? But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So what I had in mind today is this idea or question about what does it mean to have good enough relationships? And sometimes it may feel like an odd kind of a question. Sometimes people hear the phrase good enough and feels that, does it feel like we're settling? Why not, ask for something better or perfect? I think the question have come to me, I was thinking about having been here in 2019 in person, and since then we've had the pandemic, the recovery. The question of what it means to be good enough or just to be enough for the children in particular around us, whether we're parents or whether we are educators, has been very much on my mind. I think it's never too far from the awareness or consciousness of adults who are with children, because we have a kind of expectation on ourselves in terms of what does it mean to be a good teacher, a good parent, and so on. So, for example, if you do what I call a Google image search for something like good parenting, right? I use Google image search a lot, not to look for images, but to see what images represent our collective understanding or impression of a concept, right? So the way kind of Google algorithm work is that the kind of images people select the most in correspondence to a phrase are the images that you see first. So in a way, right, it's the kind of the quickest way to do a focus group, trying to see kind of, what pictures do people have in mind when they think about a concept. So for example, if I type in good parenting, these are the kinds of pictures that would come up. So I'm just going to ask everyone just to take a look at these pictures for a second, right? Just pay attention to any details that you might notice, anything similar about these pictures, right? Because these kind of represent, like, at least a visual representation as to what people think about, let's say, good parenting. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some actual scenes from our own field work. So a lot of my field work is to study how people interact with children across a variety of settings, in families, as well as in many, many different contexts. So I'm going to just switch to those pictures. What you see here, whether it's a picture or a drawing, these are not what I would call stock photos or images. These are screenshots of video recordings when we're doing our field work. And once again, I'd like you to just take a look at these images, right, of real people in real places in their everyday moments. Okay, so let me just remind you of, these are the stock images, right, that most people would probably select if they're looking for something like good parenting. And these are actual screenshots or captures of everyday scenes of caregiving during different times in different places. And if you could, I would love to invite you to just kind of write something in the chat about the differences that you notice between these two screens, the stock images and the real images. So while you do that, I'm just going to flip back and forth so that, in case you want to take another look, you can. So these are the real stuff. Okay. And these are the stock images. Right. I'm going to go back to the real scenes. Okay, so I see a couple of comments coming in on the chat. And there's noticing that the stock images, right, tend to have people who just seem to be smiling. they are quite photogenic. They look happy. I like the phrase like overly happy. It's probably like the best of the moments. And then in the real images, you don't see kind of this kind of very overt smiling. In fact, in these particular images that I chose, you couldn't see kind of what we typically would call a smile. But there's I see some of the comments like there's a lot of focus, right? Focusing on the child. There's a lot of physical contact, even though there isn't smiling. And then of course, we have kind of a variety of caregiving settings, right? So I'm using this example in part to point out that the kind of expectation sometimes we collectively, right, as a world, having our mind about what good caregiving, what good parenting should look like, uh, is just kind of a very partial or shallow representation of kind of what real caregiving looks like and feel like for children and for families and so on. And in the course of uh, my involvement in the early childhood kind of development work over maybe the last 20 years or so, we know more and more about how children develop, what is it that children need, right? We know in early childhood, we know a lot about kind of how children's brain development, so much so that it gets condensed into these somewhat simplistic slogans. We know a lot about adversity and its impact on children. And we know a lot about, things like how children's language develop and what are some of the challenges associated with those. But one of the things that we don't know a lot about is this question kind of, can any of us who are with children, whether we are parents, grandparents, caregivers, teachers, museum educators, like anyone who's actually with children, like, can any of us be enough? Okay? Like, what is enough for brain development? What is enough for language development? What is enough as far as kind of protect children from adversity and so on? And this is the question that I like to focus on and just kind of engage all of us to think about. And I'll give some examples for this, in part because I thought it's actually a very tough question to answer. There are very few research studies that I'm aware of that explicitly trying to understand what is enough. Most of the time, research study either implicitly or explicitly seem to convey the sense that you can do better, you can do more, and so they contribute kind of along with popular press kind of parenting books and so on. I think they contribute to this overall feeling of like never enough, right? Like you're always doing something wrong, or if there's something right out there, you don't know it and you miss the opportunities and so on, so forth. So I think it's important for anyone who work with children to have a sense of what is enough, right? Especially under the pressure of kind of this picture perfect, but kind of a never enough world when it comes to thinking about children and thinking about families. So I'll just give a couple of examples and how the understanding even of researchers have evolved significantly over the last 20 years when it comes to, let's say, the development of young children, although I think some of the principles that you see extend far beyond just early childhood, but extends to teens, as well as the way we interact with adults. So the first example I wanted to share it has been popularized in the early childhood research and practice and policy for almost 20 years now. It's this concept of word gap. Word gap refers to a particular study that was done in I believe, the late 1980s, published in the 90s about language development in three groups of children who are in, upper income, working class, white families, and then I'm sorry, upper income, professional class, white families, and children who are in working class families, and then children who are in families who are low income families on social welfare. And the study was just trying to understand the environments for all these children and the families and so on. But one particular finding caught people's attention in 2006 through a New York Times magazine by what is now a famous author, Paul Tough. And he categorized and talked about this particular study. And then shortly after that, it kind of exploded. Right? So every major news outlet started to talk about this study, and there's a lot of kind of policy effort in thinking about how do we close the word gap. So essentially the idea was that they find that there's this pretty big kind of vocabulary gap by age 3 for children in these different kind of social classes, and one particular factor they highlighted was this idea that somehow, by their estimates, that children in, low income families may have heard up to 30 million less words between the age, from between birth to age 3. So somehow, like, this particular finding, this particular study ended up being kind of one of the most cited studies in child development, at least over the course of the last 20 years. And for a while, that dominated policy. You even hear presidential candidates in their debates quoting, but somewhat inaccurately, about the word gap, and so on. But let's dive a little deeper, right, into is the story really about kind of word counts, right? How many words does a child hear? Because 30 million to anybody seems like a huge number, right? So any parent who's speaking with their children at, between birth and 3 is probably feeling like, wait, do I have enough? Do I have enough words there? Am I behind? Am I ahead? And at some point, right, technologists came in and say, well, let's help, parents, caregivers, and researchers. We have pedometers when we walk, right, trying to keep track of 10,000 steps. Why not have a word pedometer? So the idea resulted in this little device that's a word pedometer that you can put inside, like a vest for the children, and people use that for research. At one point, they thought this would support parents as well. And that kind of pedometer would spit out like a chart, right? We like to do, data-based decision making. So here's a chart that tells you, how many words did you say? And in these charts, it'll focus on kind of the number of words that at least this little device could record. And then they're trying to focus on conversational turns, like how do you go back and forth, right, in these terms. So I like to actually do a quick experiment with everybody. So let's pretend that we all are these word pedometers. I know we're humans. We don't have, algorithm in the back counting, but we can use our human brain to do the work. So I'm going to play 1 minute, 60 seconds of audio recording, which is what this little thing does. It records audio, right? So 60 seconds of audio recording. And I'd like all of us to listen for it and see if we can just quickly come up with a word count. Like how many words, are the children hearing in whatever interaction that is being recorded. All right, so I'm going to start the clock. So it's exactly 60 seconds. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to count the words that children hear.
Oh. Go. Go. You making bubbles? You making bubbles? Here, get your car.
Timmy's on the way.
Hey, you gonna play cards with us? You gonna play cards with us? Oh.
Take the bus. Take the bus to the city. There you go. Go take the bus to the city.
Here comes the bus. Kim's gonna play with us. You gonna play with us?
Okay, so that's a minute. Any of you who are keeping track, using a tally mark or just counting your fingers and so on, there's no correct answer because I haven't counted them one by one, but I'm curious if you can put it in the chat, kind of the approximate number of words that you were able to count within, let's say, the 60 seconds that we just have. It's a pretty wide range, which is okay, right? So we have 40, 75, 37, and 40. Okay, so we start to see like there's kind of an average, right? That'll come about. Thank you for humoring me and doing this along the way. So and yes, there's a lot of repeat words. We might imagine like, is there like a device in the back or something like that. So I don't know if you get this feeling, like as you're listening, I think part of you're trying to count, right? But another part of you trying to figure out like, wait, what are they doing, right? Because there's a lot of sounds happening there. And so the other count, this little word pedometer tries to do is what they call conversational turns. And conversational turns refer to kind of a back and forth turn taking between adults and children based on sound, right? So if an adult said something, the child says something, that's a turn, right? However, as you notice, like in this recording, you don't hear a lot of words from the children. So then, right, if you're the pedometer, like if you're using your human brain to be the pedometer, then you really have to imagine, right, and guess like what counts as a back and forth turn taking between the adults and the children, right? And so I'm just going to do this one more time. And again, do the best you can. I know you can't see the image, but neither can the word pedometer, right? The word pedometer that's supposedly keeping track of all these things, they're guessing as well. They're just guessing with their kind of built-in algorithm, but we are guessing as human beings. All right, so I'm going to play the exact same sound clip. We listen to it a second time, and this time we're going to try to come up with a count of back and forth interactions between adults and children.
Oh. Go. Go. You making bubbles? You making bubbles? Here, get your car.
Kimmy's on the way.
Hey, you gonna play cards with us? You gonna play cards with us?
Oh. Take the bus. Take the bus to the city. There you go. Go take the bus to the city.
Here comes the bus. Kim's gonna play with us? You gonna play with us?
Okay, so that's the second round. I'm sure it gets a little harder, but again, no correct answer because it takes a lot of kind of imagination to come up with the count. But anyone who have a guess on how many back and forth interactions, turns taking. So now we're all over the place. We have 4, 17, 10, 6. Okay, all right. I can imagine taking an average, we'll come up to something, but it's much harder, right? Unlike counting words, which, if we listen to a couple times, eventually, like all of us will get to an exact number that are going to be very close to each other. For the interaction part, it's much, much harder. So we obviously can't leave you unsatisfied now that you listen to the audio twice. Let me just paint the scene a little bit. So this is a childcare center for infants and toddlers. And on this particular day, they were participating, right, in a study. So they all had these little pedometers inside the vests of the children, but we happened to be there. It wasn't our study, but we happened to be there at the same time. So we were recording not the sound, but we were recording the interactions themselves. So however you were thinking about, the word count and interactions, I just want to give you a chance to see, like, what is it actually happening? Krista just shared her comment that with very young children, like sounds and facial expressions can count as the serve and return interaction, right? So you may not be able to hear it, but when you see it, you know it. So here's the exact same minute, but now it's on film.
Oh. Go. Go. You making bubbles? You making bubbles? Here, get your car.
Kimmy's on the way.
Hey, you gonna play cards with us? You gonna play cards with us? Oh.
Take the bus. Take the bus to the city. There you go. Go take the bus to the city.
Here comes the bus. Kim's gonna play with us? You gonna play with us?
Okay, so now you've had a chance to see the video. Right, a smile return should count as well. I'm curious, what did you see? Like when you see the video, what is it that you saw that you couldn't have imagined right? Just listening to the audio, even if you listen to the audio like, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, like, is there something here you just you couldn't have imagined? There's a lot of nonverbal turn taking, right? There's so many different ways the young children express themselves, right? The audio doesn't capture the faces of the adults or the children, and right, it can show the focus, it can show the focus to each of the children, right? Helping each of the children feeling that they are part of this little community. And Krista was sharing kind of this idea of powerful interactions. There's something like when we see the whole thing, right? We get a sense that these things are really powerful. Like it's not just about like, oh, I'm hearing words and getting vocabulary. Like there's something a lot more than what these numbers seem to capture. And then, so part of our work is to not to reduce that richness that you just saw, right, into these numbers, but trying to capture the richness as a whole, trying to see kind of what these richness represent in the course of the work. And unlike the what I would call the caricature, right, the kind of almost like media condensed version or the soundbite of development that's captured by the concept of the word gap, what over time what we come to understand even about language development, right, is that when children have variabilities in their vocabulary, right, not just between social classes, sometimes the studies are done, let's say, exclusively within high income white families, and you still would find variations within that kind of narrow group. So however you do that study, what you ended up finding, this is from the work of my colleague at our school, Dr. Meredith Rowe and Catherine Snow, that what they find is that what you consistently see is that quality, measures of quality, right, accounts for a huge amount of variability in vocabulary. What is quality? Well, quality is the kind of richness that you just saw, right, in these interactions. And then by the time you quantify it, let's say to the number of words or something, they do matter, but they don't matter nearly as much, right, as the measures for the quality of the interactions, the richness of the interactions, as opposed to reducing it to a number. And of course, variability has to do with a lot of other kind of social, economical, environmental factors and so on. So the key message here seems to be that, yes, quality and quantity both matter, but between the two, quality matters decisively. Why is it important to think about the science in this way, as opposed to the much catchier kind of 30 million words gap, by the time you're 3? Well, the reason I think this is incredibly important, and this is summarized by my colleague Meredith Rowe and the pediatrician Barry Zuckerman, who's right here in Boston, who was one of the founders of the program called Reach Out and Read, which is a national program to engage pediatricians to support families in reading and so on. And what they described is that this whole concept, right, of thinking about child development as a word gap, they oversimplify the phenomenon of human development. The implied focus on the quantity of how much a parent talks obscure the fact that there are much more essential components of parent-child communication or interaction that goes beyond kind of hearing more words. It has to do with developmental sequence and quality. Sequence means like the way you communicate with a baby, right, with facial expressions and blowing bubbles and so on, is very different the way you would communicate with a 4-year-old. And the quality has to do with all that richness that we were able to see on the video. And their conclusion, right, from not just one single study, but from the cumulative study about children's language development, is that parents shouldn't get the wrong message and be stressed out about talking all the time or meeting a set number of words per day, but instead they can focus on finding time for even very brief, high quality, loving interactions. And this is especially important for parents who work second, third jobs, who feel like they couldn't spend enough time with their children, who feel very guilty about that not enoughness. But it's important for parents to understand that the quality of their interaction when they are able to be with their children are profoundly important. Right? And it's a message that feels very, very different, right? From this almost overwhelming idea that, is your child 30 million words behind other children just because, you can't be there or you're not available. So that's an example of the kind of science that help us to understand what does it mean, right, to be enough in the course of working with children, as opposed to kind of the much more simplistic version of some of these stories that make us feel like it's not enough. So it turns out that if we look carefully, what we find is that we find this enough kind of message in lots and lots of science that once upon a time gave us the not enough kind of feeling. So I'll dive into a second area, the most common area of science that we talk about in early childhood, neural development, right? So over the last 20 years, every time we talk about young children, someone is going to say something about young children's brain. And of course, just like the 30 million word gap, the brain part gets reduced very quickly to this idea of, what percent of the brain is formed, prior to age what. The commonly used number is 90%. I've seen 80, but regardless what the exact number is, that's kind of the slogan, right? And if you, do a Google image search for young child or brain or child and brain, you get these images, right? You get, and all of them collectively seem to convey this sense that, these young children's brain, they're developing so fast. We got to do everything we can, right? As quickly as we can, from birth to 1 to 2 to 3, because, this is a period of rapid growth. And there's something about this idea that if 90 or 80% of their brain is formed before they turn 3, then if we don't do something, we're going to be too late. so all of that, right, creates kind of a bit of a pressure, kind of a rush, right, to do whatever it is we can before the age of 3 or 5 and so on, because we think of early childhood development as primarily kind of feeding the brain. Well, it turns out that if we actually looked a little deeper, a little wider about the science of brain, what we find is something that is much closer to the kind of conclusions that the researchers came up with in language development than it is about, like, the baby Einstein kind of a vision of a brain. As you recall, like, even in word gap, it's not about the 30 million words per se. It's really about kind of supporting families to have even very brief, high quality, loving interactions. So what is it that we learn from all the actual science of brain? Over the last approximately 5 years, there's kind of this new development or new sub-branch of brain development that's very interesting. So most of the time when we talk about brain development for children, we are talking about one single brain, which is the child's brain, right? There's this kind of rule of thumb in the understanding of human development. We just call it the principle of reciprocity. And reciprocity means that in any kind of developmental phenomenon, whether it's language development or brain development, whatever happens to one end of the relationship and interactions, you can expect reciprocally that something else is happening on the other end, because human development and human interactions tend to be a kind of a two-way street, right? So if I do something to impact you, you simultaneously are impacting me, right? So if you take that principle, you apply it to brain science, you go, wait a minute. So if young children's brain are developing rapidly in those early days, then reciprocally, that ought to impact the people who are with children, right? So if the people who are with children are impacting children's brain development, then the children must be impacting the people, the adults, right? Caregivers and teachers and so on. So that particular field, for lack of a better term, is focused on not the children's brain, but the caregiving brain in the adult. And the caregiving brain is referring to not a region in the brain, but referring to a network. It's often called the caregiving network. And the reason it's not a region is because in order to provide care, right, to a child, to another human being, we have to involve a lot of our different parts of our brain function. I'll give two very simple examples, right? So one is our attention system. We, if we have a child, we are particularly sensitive to hearing them, right? Hearing their sound, and then be able to think about, is that a distress sound, or is that just an attention seeking sound? Something like that. We also become very attuned visually, right? When we watched the video earlier, you saw kind of how the adult is attuned to the facial expressions, to the body languages of the child. So like we're very sensitive, right? In terms of kind of trying to see everything about the child. So that's the visual part. But these visual attention part has to be connected, right, to our feeling part. So if our child is just distressed, we feel worried. If our child seems to be happy, they're giggling, we feel rewarded, and kind of happiness kind of floods, over ourselves. And then, same thing with kind of what we see the child, or we see a child, calm, or we see a child agitated, or whatever it is. So you can see kind of how different parts of the brain have to be working together, right, in order for us to provide care. In this case, we're talking about infants, but I imagine that that would be true for anyone who provides care almost to anybody. So what happens is that over the last 5 years or so, it becomes clearer and clearer that not only is that child's brain changing, that the adult brain, particularly the caregiving network and the way they connect and coordinate with each other, is changing significantly during those early years. And for birth mothers, what they find is that the caregiving brain actually strengthens and connects and reorganizes itself even prior to childbirth. So it's just like the rest of the body. It's almost like getting ready, right? It's the brain and the body's way of remodeling, trying to get ready for the arrival of the child. And from any of us who thought, about kind of the biological changes in birth mothers, this isn't surprising, right, in research. So what is interesting, and what is particularly interesting to me, was when these studies are replicated for fathers, right? Both biological fathers and then adoptive fathers. And similar study have been done on adoptive and foster parents, mothers and fathers. So here are adults who have no biological ties to the child, but who nevertheless are engaged with the children. And what they find is that even though for these adults, right, these kind of the caregiving part of the brain doesn't kind of turn on ahead of time, but nevertheless, they are strengthened and remodeled and wired in almost a very similar way, not as a result of biological triggers, but as a result of actual daily caregiving interactions. Some of these interactions can be as simple as physically holding a child, right, for however many kind of hours a day. But of course, interactions are a lot more than just holding the child, right? It's this idea of being with the child. So what that seemed to kind of echo, right, is this idea that I mentioned earlier about the word gap, that these brief, high quality, loving interactions, they not only matter for something like vocabulary or language development, they matter fundamentally even in the brain science of the adult. that the adult's brain is getting better and better wired to provide care, and the better care, of course, is supporting the child's brain, and then the more interactive the child becomes, and then of course it's strengthening the adult's brain to be able to interact with the child. So this beautiful kind of reciprocal two-way process that happens over and over again between in the neuroscience studies, it's between children and adults, but children and parents. But I imagine that you can imagine similar kind of mechanisms happening between children and anyone who works with children on a regular basis, whether they're museum educators, early childhood educators, and so on. So all of that is to show two examples of how we can take the science of what we used to know, the science that sometimes gets simplified to slogans like this and to images like this, and that somehow give us this feeling that, oh, we got to do more, we got to do things quickly and so on. But what seems to be actually true, right, is this idea that there's something foundationally important in the development of children. And in this case, I'm just talking about children when they're young, but I invite any of you to extend that through childhood, all the way to adolescence, all the way to young adulthood. And there's this emerging name for this concept, or for what I think like it's the science of what it means to be enough. And the term is early relational health, right? And this idea is that early relational health serves as a foundation, right? Because we typically, when we think of health, what do we think of? We think of physical health, we think of mental health a lot, and of course, we think about behavioral health. And you can think of these health as like pillars of well-being, right? So we build well-being on top of the health. So you got physical health, behavioral health, and mental health. But anytime you see like a building that are like that, like there's the thing you build on top of the pillar, but then there's the thing that's under the pillar. Sometimes it's called a foundation stone, right? Like you can't put these pillars like on sand or on shifting sand, because it won't hold up anything, right? So like all these pillars have to sit on something very solid, like a foundation stone. So I think of early relational health as this foundation stone. And where does early relational health comes from? Well, it comes from these relational interactions, right? So when a caregiver and a child are just like making faces at each other, this isn't just about like, oh, someday I'm going to teach you vocabulary. Like this is fundamentally laying the foundation, right, upon which all these other pillars eventually would be built. And so and if you take away the word early, you just think about relational health, I think the same concept applies for school age children, for adolescents, for parents themselves, for caregivers, for teachers themselves. And so part of thinking about promoting early relational health, you have to start with understanding the relational needs of the child, right? That's something I think we do naturally. Like, you go out and you say children need relationships, not a single person would disagree with you, right? Like everyone would go, yeah, of course, children, whether they're 3 or 13, they need human relationships. But the second part is just as important, which is to respect and support the relational caregiving capacity of the adults, right? To respect it, to trust it, to know that adults have that capacity, whether it's in their brain or whether it's somewhere else, even if they don't have biological triggers, to trust that if you support them, if you create the conditions for them to interact with the children, that part of their capacity gets strengthened all the way inside their brain as well as the rest of their body. And that we collectively, as a community, as people, we can support the capacity of the adults. We can support them, and the incredible impact and significance of that is that even when we think about the kind of stressful period of the pandemic and so on, or any other stress that impacts families and children day in and day out, what the research consistently shows is that even under very stressful conditions, the presence of supportive, responsive relationships with caring adults as early in life, certainly, but throughout the lifespan, they can help to prevent and they can help reverse the damaging effects of the kind of toxic responses that sometimes children gets to develop under prolonged stress. So, not all of us have the capacity to prevent, to stop kind of all stress, right, from, happening to our children. And I'm not sure if that's even desirable, right? However, the importance of having adults who are supportive, responsive in their unique ways to what, in their unique and authentic ways, right, to children under everyday scenarios, under unusual circumstances like the pandemic, even in places as difficult as orphanages and so on. These are the things that makes adults enough, right, in the lives of children. Enough meaning that within their capacity, their resources, they are able to do extraordinary things for children. I'll end here and I'll just share one resource. My colleagues and I, over the last 15 years or so, thought a lot about kind of what does it mean to recognize the simple, ordinary, mundane, everyday things we do as adults, and how these become the basic building blocks of healthy relationships or relational health. And you can find resources, including our kind of very pictorial tool on this website called simpleinteractions.org. It's a completely open website. You don't have to sign in. You don't have to do anything. All the tools are just there. And I hope just to leave you with this idea that whenever, when we're with children, that we think about, like, what does it mean to be enough? How can we be enough? That each of us may, within whatever capacity we have, to help the caregivers and the caregiving professionals around us, to help them to recognize what can be enough in a world that sometimes feel like it seems to always tell us never enough. So on that note, let me just end here, and I'd love to, interact and have any conversations here.
Junlei, thank you so much. I was madly taking notes through your whole talk because there's so much here that applies, of course, to our work at the Discovery Museum. My life as a parent, I think we all can find different ways of relating to this. Thank you for a wonderful and really powerful program tonight. I have a few questions for you from our audience. And let me start maybe in response to your last slide. We know that parents, particularly parents of younger children, are facing a higher level of mental health crisis now than they have ever before. And it seems like your reassuring message would be a great antidote to all of that. So why do you think there continues to be so much correction instead of affirmation in the world of parenting?
I think parents, as I understand it, when I work with parents are often their own harshest critic, right? And I think parents, under whatever kind of societal influence, and in this case, I think it impacts mothers even a lot more than fathers, but that they hold themselves to this incredibly high, perfect standard, and there's not a lot of message at all in the world that reassures parents that they are enough. And if they go on, social media or even the bookstore, right, there's plenty of messages that says exactly the opposite. But on the other hand, what I have found is that there's a lot of us, like all around parents, including parents ourselves, can do that for each other. I was just with the Reach Out and Read network of pediatricians who have for 30 years, right, have been thinking about how do we bring encouragement and reassurance to parents. And so even just during the very brief well child visits, right, these pediatricians kind of think about, how do they find opportunities to reassure, reaffirm with parents that their simple, ordinary interactions matter, right? And they matter a great deal, and the best of the pediatricians can do it. But what I mean is that we don't necessarily have to be pediatricians. I think parents will listen to anyone that they trust. So they trust pediatricians, but parents a lot of times trust other parents, and then parents trust their families. Parents a lot of times trust their childcare providers. And so there's lots and lots of messages. I have a researcher who, along with me, wrote the early relational health report, and she had a baby when we were finishing the report. And then even though she know all these in research and intellectually, when her baby was in childcare, and when, you know, her baby, like, sometimes, you know, like, have these very normal reactions of not running to her when she comes to pick up the baby, because like she start to feel like I'm not enough. Like, you know, can I really balance like working as a parent, and it was the childcare provider who reassured her, who's like, oh, don't you worry, this does not mean your child doesn't love you anymore. We see this all the time, and your child absolutely loves you. And of course, you know, within weeks and so on, everything is back to normal. So anyhow, that any one of us who if we're ever in a position to be trusted by a parent, we have the opportunity to offer that affirmation and encouragement.
Well, that's a great gift that we can all maybe commit to providing as a group tonight. Um, in terms of quality interactions, what recommendations might you have for parents whose children may struggle with certain kinds of interactions due to sensory sensitivities or being on the autism spectrum?
Yeah. So on that front, one of the we still do, but we used to work with community schools for children who are neurodiverse, or who otherwise have, you know, developmental delays, you know, just a variety of challenges. And one of the things that I find parents struggle with is, one, this desire for the child to quote unquote catch up, right? To catch up with the typical quote unquote normal development pace, and the more they see the gap between kind of their child and what they consider to be normal and typical, the more anxious they become. They feel like they're not doing enough. I must be doing something wrong. I must be doing something, you know, not enough. And what the best kind of teachers and educators in these settings, they not only work with the children, but they work with the parents, right? They help parents see that instead of kind of measuring your child here with what you think they should be, like, just pay attention to the little steps that your child makes day in and day out, right? And that's when parents, I think, can gradually discover and trust that they have the capacity to discover like all the little supports that they can provide their child. That of course they need the support of professionals and others, but parents themselves are incredible discoverers. And so one of the things that I think the difference between never enough and enough, particularly when it comes to parents whose children are neurodiverse or who have other developmental kind of needs, is that sometimes as the adult, you feel like the only way I can be enough is if I understand all of the science, the strategies, the tools in order to do this job, right? In order to be a parent. But I think often as a parent and as a teacher too, like you can be enough if you just each day you strive to know your child like better than anybody else. Like you may not know all of the science, all of the strategy, but you know your child. You know the little things about your child. You know what your child needs, and you know the kind of things your child can do even without your support. And the more you get to know all those little things, right, the more enough you become, as opposed to feeling like, no, I just, you know, I better go back to school and get a whole degree, you know, in doing this kind of work.
Sounds like you talk about child brain development as being sort of a gradual progression, right? There are not going to be, for many kids, there's not one big landmark moment, right? It's small steps along the way on a larger trajectory. And it sounds like parent professional development is really the same way too, right? We have to give ourselves the understanding to grow over the course of our lives as parents, right? And our understanding of what to do. Junlei, it's 8 o'clock. We promised everybody we would let them go. Can I ask you one more super quick question before we wrap up tonight? I would love if you could just give us one word about do-overs. All of us as parents have had those moments where we didn't do our maybe very best. We weren't fully present. Do those moments when we are not at our best sort of take away from the effectiveness of the moments when we are enough?
Okay. So the one word I would share, it's not mine. It comes from an infant mental health researcher and expert in the Boston area named Ed Tronick. And he's most famously associated with the still face experiment. If you ever seen online the still face experiment on Google or something, you would say. But the word he uses, and I've come to love it, which is repair. Repair. And it is, I think he was one of those researchers who always articulated this enoughness, right? So sometimes, like, if there's a disconnect with the child, if there's even a rupture with the child, like, we as a parent feel badly, like we did something wrong, right? And Edtronic and others would argue that actually the most developmental experience that a child could have is not a life that never have any disconnects, never have any conflicts, never have any ruptures. That's not a real life, right? But what children and parents seem to get the most out of is that when you're disconnected, you find a way to reconnect. And when you have a rupture, you find a way to repair. And when you have a conflict, you find a way to understand. It is not actually even the understanding or the reparation or the connection that ultimately matters. It's the in-between. It's to go from disconnect to connect, to from rupture to repair, and from conflict to understanding. It's that process, and it's being devoted to putting forth the effort in that process that is incredibly developmental for the child and for the parent. And so repair, I think, to me, is that word.
That is wonderful. And that sounds like something that we need more of in the world in general. So we will take
in general, yes.
take that into our evenings. Thank you so very much for a wonderful evening and for filling our minds with lots of positivity and affirmation tonight, Junlei. Thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie.